In 1945, Emperor Haile Selassie sat down with American advisors and made a decision that would change African aviation forever. He wanted an airline. Not a big one, not a global one, just 5 small propeller aircraft flying a single weekly route between Addis Ababa and Cairo. That was it. That was the beginning. 80 years later, that same airline carries 19 million passengers a year. It flies to 161 destinations across 6 continents. It generates $7.6 billion in annual revenue. It owns stakes in airlines across 5 African countries, and it is now building what will become the largest airport in Africa, a mega hub designed to handle 110 million passengers a year. While South African Airways collapsed, while Kenya Airways spent years drowning in debt, while over a dozen African carriers simply disappeared, Ethiopian Airlines just kept growing. The question is, how? Because this is not a story about luck. It is not a story about oil money or government handouts. It is a story about a strategy so disciplined, so patient, and so deliberately built over 8 decades that the results look almost impossible from the outside. To understand what Ethiopian Airlines became, you first need to understand what it started as, and why that starting point made everything that followed so remarkable. In 1945, Ethiopia had just emerged from Italian occupation. Emperor Haile Selassie had been restored to power. The country was poor, landlocked in ambition, and completely disconnected from the global economy. Selassie understood that isolation was Ethiopia's biggest enemy, and that an airline was not a luxury, it was infrastructure. He reached out to the United States, the United Kingdom, and France for help. The Americans responded. Trans World Airlines, TWA, signed an agreement with Ethiopia and sent in its own pilots, technicians, administrators, and accountants to run the operation. The Ethiopian government provided the money. TWA provided everything else. On December 21, 1945, Ethiopian Airlines was officially founded. On April 8, 1946, it flew its first revenue service, a weekly route from Addis Ababa to Cairo. The entire fleet was 5 surplus Douglas C-47 aircraft, the same propeller-driven workhorses the US military had used in World War II. For most of that first decade, Ethiopian Airlines was essentially an American airline operating on Ethiopian soil. The general managers came from TWA, the pilots were American, the maintenance teams were imported, and yet, something unusual happened. While other African nations that set up airlines in the same era handed operational control to foreign partners indefinitely, Ethiopia did something different. It started training its own people from day one. Every foreign pilot who sat in an Ethiopian cockpit was paired with an Ethiopian trainee. Every TWA engineer who maintained the aircraft was working alongside an Ethiopian technician. The goal was not to remain dependent. The goal was to learn and then take over. By the time TWA's management contract ended in 1975, Ethiopian Airlines had its own pilots, its own engineers, its own management. The transition happened without a single operational crisis. That patience, that willingness to build for the long term while accepting short-term dependence, would become the defining characteristic of everything Ethiopian Airlines did afterward. Here is something almost nobody outside Africa talks about when they discuss Ethiopian Airlines. This airline did not grow up in a stable, peaceful environment. It grew up in one of the most turbulent political landscapes on the planet. In 1974, Emperor Haile Selassie was overthrown in a military coup. A brutal Marxist regime called the Derg took power and ran the country for the next 17 years. Ethiopia went through civil war, a devastating famine in 1984 that killed over 1 million people and shocked the entire world, and constant regional conflicts. During all of this, Ethiopian Airlines kept flying. It kept expanding its routes. It kept updating its fleet. In 1984, the same year the famine images were broadcast around the world, Ethiopian became the first African airline to order the Boeing 767. Not because the country was thriving, but because the airline's management understood that the only way to survive was to never stop moving forward. The Derg regime actually helped in one unintended way. Because the government was politically isolated and globally sanctioned, Ethiopian Airlines became one of Ethiopia's only connections to the outside world. Closing it was simply not an option. The airline was too important, economically, diplomatically, and symbolically, to be allowed to fail. When the Derg finally collapsed in 1991 and a new government took over, Ethiopian Airlines emerged not just intact, but stronger. While competitors across Africa had been strangled by political interference, mismanagement, and chronic underfunding, Ethiopia's management had been allowed unusual independence, because the airline was too valuable to politics for the government to mess with. That protection, the government owning the airline but largely staying out of its decisions, became the foundational advantage that no other African carrier could replicate. To understand how Ethiopian Airlines became Africa's dominant carrier, you need to understand what happened to everyone else. South African Airways was once far larger and more powerful than Ethiopian. It started international flights to Europe in 1945. It flew to New York in 1968. By the 1970s, it operated 23 Boeing 747s and was one of the most respected airlines in the Southern Hemisphere. Then apartheid destroyed it. International sanctions grounded its long-haul routes. It was banned from flying over most of Africa. Its revenue collapsed. By the time apartheid ended in 1994 and the airline was theoretically free to rebuild, it had lost 2 decades of network development and competitive positioning. It was never able to fully recover. During the COVID-19 pandemic, South African Airways collapsed entirely, grounded for nearly 3 years, surviving only through a partial government bailout. It remains a shadow of what it once was. Kenya Airways presented a different kind of collapse. For years, it was seen as the most promising challenger to Ethiopian's dominance, but in 2017, it made a catastrophic decision, taking on over $800 million in debt to purchase 7 new aircraft and a new engine. The following year, it became insolvent. The pandemic made everything worse. The weakening Kenyan shilling amplified its debt burden. Kenya Airways spent years fighting for survival, recording its first operating profit in 7 years only in 2023, and even then, remaining net loss-making once debt payments were deducted. Nigeria Air never even launched properly. Air Zimbabwe collapsed multiple times. Ghana's carrier imploded. Across the continent, airline after airline fell to the same pattern. Political interference, government mismanagement, chronic underfunding, and the inability to build the kind of long-term strategic discipline that Ethiopian had spent 80 years developing. The result was that as African air travel demand grew, and it grew substantially, there was only one African carrier large enough, modern enough, and connected enough to absorb that demand: Ethiopian Airlines. When South African Airways pulled back from intercontinental routes, Ethiopian moved in. When Kenya Airways retreated from certain African destinations, Ethiopian added them. When the continent needed a hub that could connect African travelers to the rest of the world, Ethiopian's Addis Ababa hub, positioned almost perfectly at the geographic center of the continent, was the obvious choice. The geography matters more than people realize. Addis Ababa sits at the crossroads between Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. A flight from Addis Ababa to London is roughly the same distance as a flight to Dubai, Beijing, or Mumbai. That central position means Ethiopian can operate as a genuine connecting hub for an entire continent, not just a regional carrier. On March 10, 2019, Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302 took off from Addis Ababa, bound for Nairobi. 6 minutes after departure, the aircraft entered an uncontrollable dive. It hit the ground at nearly 600 miles per hour, creating a crater 90 feet wide and 120 feet deep. All 157 people on board were killed. The aircraft was a Boeing 737 MAX 8, just 4 months old. It was the second fatal crash of a Boeing 737 MAX in less than 5 months. The first had been Lion Air Flight 610 in Indonesia, which killed 189 people. Both crashes were caused by the same system, MCAS, a flight control software that Boeing had added to the MAX and not adequately disclosed to pilots or regulators. The Ethiopian Airlines crash triggered the global grounding of the entire 737 MAX fleet. Every MAX in service around the world was taken out of the sky, Boeing's worst crisis in its history. The company eventually agreed to pay over $2.5 billion in a fraud conspiracy settlement with the U.S. Department of Justice. For Ethiopian Airlines, the crash was a catastrophe on multiple levels. 157 lives lost. The aircraft at the center of its fleet expansion plans grounded indefinitely, a reputational cloud hanging over an airline that had spent decades building its brand. Here is how Ethiopian responded. First, it immediately grounded its own MAX aircraft even before regulators required it, before the FAA, before most other authorities. The airline moved quickly and transparently, communicating clearly with passengers and the public. Second, it cooperated fully with investigators and released its findings without delay, placing the blame squarely on Boeing's MCAS system. Third, and this is the part that reveals everything about Ethiopian's character, it announced it would be the last airline to resume flying the 737 MAX after the global grounding ended. Not the first, the last. It waited for every major regulator, the FAA, the European Union, China, and Ethiopia's own authority, to complete their recertification before resuming MAX flights in February 2022. That decision cost the airline operationally, but it communicated something more valuable, that Ethiopian Airlines would never prioritize speed over safety. For an airline building a global brand across decades, that was the right calculation. And the growth never stopped. Throughout the MAX grounding, Ethiopian kept expanding with its other aircraft, kept adding routes, kept building its hub. Most airlines think in terms of routes. Ethiopian Airlines thinks in terms of empires. While other carriers were trying to survive, Ethiopian was quietly building something that no other African airline had attempted, a pan-African aviation network, not through routes alone, but through ownership stakes in airlines across the continent. Look at what Ethiopian Airlines controls today. It holds a 27% stake in ASKI Airlines, which operates as a West African hub out of Lome, Togo, connecting Ethiopia's network to Francophone West Africa. It holds 49% of Malawi Airlines, operating a secondary hub in Lilongwe. It owns 45% of Zambia Airways in Lusaka. It holds 49% of Guinea Airways, and it owns 49% of Air Congo, giving it a footprint in the Democratic Republic of Congo, one of Africa's largest and most aviation underserved countries. Ethiopian Airlines has already achieved something remarkable, but the airline is not done. It completed its previous strategic plan, called Vision 2025, ahead of schedule. It is now executing Vision 2035, a 15-year plan with a single stated ambition, to become one of the top 20 most competitive aviation groups in the world, not in Africa, in the world. And to achieve that, it needs infrastructure that matches the ambition. The current Bole International Airport in Addis Ababa is operating beyond its comfortable capacity. Ethiopian Airlines has already signed contracts to build a new mega airport, located 40 kilometers from the current hub, at a lower elevation that removes one of the main operational challenges of flying at Addis Ababa's high altitude. When complete, the new airport is designed to handle 110 million passengers per year, 4 times the current capacity. The African Development Bank has signed on as the lead arranger for financing, making it officially Africa's largest aviation infrastructure project. To put that in perspective, London Heathrow, Europe's busiest airport, handles around 80 million passengers a year. Ethiopian Airlines is planning to build something larger than Heathrow in a landlocked East African country that most Western travelers have barely thought about as an aviation destination. Ethiopian Airlines started with 5 aircraft and a single weekly route. Today it operates 170 aircraft to 161 destinations across 6 continents. It generates $7.6 billion in revenue. It controls stakes in airlines across 5 African countries. It has won Africa's Best Airline Award 8 years in a row. It survived war, famine, political upheaval, a global pandemic, and the worst aviation disaster in its history, and came out of each one larger than it went in. South African Airways collapsed. Kenya Airways nearly went under. Over a dozen African carriers simply disappeared. Ethiopian Airlines just kept going. The secret was never one thing. It was the combination of geographic advantage, government protection without government interference, a long-term training philosophy that started on day one, a multi-hub expansion strategy that mirrors what the Gulf carriers did with their hubs, and a disciplined refusal to let short-term crises derail long-term goals. The airline that Emperor Haile Selassie started to modernize his country has done something far larger than that. It has become the spine of African aviation. And with a mega airport under development and Vision 2035 in execution, it is not finished yet. Now I want to hear from you. Do you think Ethiopian Airlines can genuinely break into the world's top 20 aviation groups? Or are there challenges, economic, political, infrastructural, that will hold it back? Let me know in the comments. If this video gave you a new perspective on African aviation, hit the like button and subscribe. Every video on this channel is a deep dive into the strategies, the collapses, and the empires behind the world's biggest airlines and car companies. The next one drops soon.